Alright, this is Proverbs chapter 18. This is my reading and commentary. Now today is a bit strange in terms of my feeling. We all have these days every once in a while that seem to stand out more than others. Who knows why? Perhaps I'm a little bit more awake today than others. But hopefully this affords me an interesting way to understand the verses that are before me here. So chapter 18. Through desire a man, having separated himself, seeks and intermeddles with all wisdom. A fool has no delight in understanding, but that his heart may discover itself. When the wicked come, then come also contempt, and with ignominy reproach. The words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, and the wellspring of wisdom as a flowing brook. It is not good to accept the person of the wicked, to overthrow the righteous in judgment. A fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calls for strokes. A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. The words of a tale-bearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. He also that is slothful in his work is brother to him that is a great waster. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous runneth into it, and is safe. The rich man's wealth is his strong city, and as a high wall in his own conceit. Before destruction, the heart of man is haughty, and before honor is humility. He that answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. The spirit of a man will sustain his infirmity, but a wounded spirit who can bear? The heart of the prudent gets knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. A man's gift makes room for him, and brings him before great men. He that is first in his own cause seems just, but his neighbor comes and searches him. The lot causes contentions to cease, and pareth between the mighty. A brother offered his harder to be won than a strong city, and their contentions are like bars of a castle. A man's belly shall be satisfied with the fruit of his mouth, and with the increase of his lips shall he be filled. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. Whoso finds a wife finds a good thing, and obtains favor of the Lord. The poor uses entreaties, but the rich answers roughly. A man that has friends must shew himself friendly, and there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. So that is chapter 18. Now let's go through these verses. Verse 1 says, through desire a man, having separated himself, seeks and intermeddles with all wisdom. So the in-between, the words having separated himself, I think is a place that we have to start. I think we all understand what it means to desire, how that can influence our behavior. Having separated himself. Now exactly what does it mean to separate himself? I think we can interpret this both in a positive light and in a negative one. Through desire, a man, that in and of itself could be positive or negative desire, having separated himself, again a positive or a negative. A positive in the sense of a self that has become oriented inwardly, that cares of nothing but itself. A self that requires this separation in order for it to be dissolved, to be made anew, perhaps. Now, of course, we can imagine this as not the self, but himself relative to other people, having separated himself as in isolating himself away from others so that he may focus on something in particular. And this is followed by seeking and intermeddling with all wisdom. This again, in and of itself, can be a positive or a negative. The word intermeddle seems to have a negative connotation to it. That is, to mix something. Perhaps in a sense to confuse, or to be within something, to mix something that one ought not to be mixing in. It can be interpreted as out of place for this person to be here. And so if we were to retrace our steps back through this verse, I think that the general trend is in this negative direction, that this person is indeed isolating himself. He is meddling in his own desire. He is seeking and intermeddling with all wisdom. He is trying to do something that which is impossible for one person to do all alone. Here we have the expression of the dangers of self-centeredness and of the perversion of desire, even if it is towards wanting to understand, seeking wisdom. Everything seems to have a danger. Every good seems to have an underside. There's always another side to the coin. And when I said at the outset that there are positive and negatives here, I think that still stands. Because it is not the case that all desire of man is bad. It is not the case that separation and isolation in certain instances are always bad. Sometimes it can serve a good purpose. And it is not the case that seeking wisdom or understanding is bad. But if we were, for a moment, which I think we have highlighted to a degree, but perhaps trying to flesh out a little bit more here. Through desire, a man, having separated himself, seeks and intermeddles with all wisdom. Why might this be bad? In the first instance, something that we have touched on is that overly inward focus. This inward focus, this attention that we place upon ourselves and upon our own desire, is a closed loop. It is a closed circuit. There is potential for deception. There is potential for self-centeredness, but that doesn't say much, self-centeredness. It's just repeating what I had mentioned. As with many things in the Proverbs, the constant warning of the dangers of selfishness, they are always present. And we find again that within this closed loop, within the deception of the self, within the wickedness, that everything from without, everything outside of us is only there to serve our subjective desire. The warning is, in some sense, a call, for certainly all of us have selfish tendencies. We all have individual identities. We all have a self. And drawing lines and making boundaries around that self is difficult. We have to do it because we have to understand and identify it. We cannot completely destroy it, nor should we want to. I think we should respect the boundaries for where they are, but the important thing is to identify that there are boundaries and what exactly it means to cross them. And the highlight here is the word intermeddle. It is the seeking, but within the seeking within the isolation. This leads to the confusion that we can infer from this word intermeddle, that is to mix among, with all wisdom. And when I think of all wisdom, it's sort of it's interesting to say all. That would seem to suggest that there are pieces of wisdom that we can put together that would be all. Like I have in front of me here about 15 coins or so. And it is not the fact that there is a coin, there are coins. And together they are all of the coins. And if I took each one of the coins, certainly I can identify one from another, just as our self has an identity from some other self. It's clearly identifiable. It is something that can be separated. Now, in the case of the coin, it doesn't really matter much if I mix them together. Perhaps there's a certain situation, a certain context in which mixing them together wouldn't be a good idea, as if I was attempting to count them and I continually mixed them. That would be antithetical to my goal. But of course, wisdom is more of a complex thing than just a number of coins sitting on a desk. But if we are to draw that parallel, that there are different paths perhaps that we can identify, illuminate, as being a path to wisdom, it is an experience of wisdom in and of itself, and there are different ones. Now, I've mentioned before, and there is an image up on the channel of this man standing before a mountain. There's a few images that represent this general thought that is, we can think of the staircase too. I think there's an image of that up there. And that generally represents a process of transcendence. The process itself is an interesting conversation, but the main point here is that there is a point at the top, that there is this narrowing towards some centralized authority. Perhaps we can say this centralized thing that represents a good, a supreme good that unites all of the different possible ways that a person can ascend a mountain and reach that peak. Now, within the different paths by which one takes to reach that peak or to ascend it, for it is a matter of discussion whether man can actually get there. It certainly is impossible for him to get there because his perception is limited. He can ascend and he could transcend to a peak of his own nature, perhaps, but in terms of the entirety of the divine, it's not within his nature. But nonetheless, understanding wisdom in this way, again, all the different paths around this mountain that lead up to that center, what does it mean to intermeddle with all of these paths around that mountain? Well, I think the most important thing probably would be when we intermix these different experiences together, the experiences become confused. And that what we attend to, that allows us to keep going, that allows us to make sense of the path that we are on, that gives us some direction that we are actually going towards the peak rather than just sort of circling around the circumference of the mountain at the base. If we can confuse ourselves to such a degree that this occurs and that no ascent happens, then of course this is antithetical to the very pursuit of wisdom. And so the danger is through his desire for this wisdom and the intermeddling that can cause him to lose focus, that he will not be able to attend to things that are important. Again, the things that are important serve to guide him on his journey. Without proper attention to those things, he will become lost. Now, I think the primary meaning of, as I've said, having separated himself is, it means isolation from others. It means isolation from outside information. It means isolation and withdrawal into the self. But if we are to view man and who he is as integrally connected to that which is outside of him, and that, perhaps this is confusing territory, but there must be, we had this discussion about boundaries not too long ago. I would like to make the case that his relationship to the world, that which is outside of the boundary of the self, is not entirely beyond himself, because it is this relationship, it is this process of becoming, this process of change, the process of transcendence. We do not like stagnation. Now, not necessarily stagnation as to be interpreted as the stopping of movement or the peaceful nature of man's life, perhaps. When he reaches a certain age, perhaps he changes things around. Perhaps he values things a little bit differently. He spends his days a little bit differently. I think there's a certain culture around the word, possibly around the word stagnation, that is not quite what I mean. When I mean stagnation, I mean stagnant. I imagine a pool of water that has been there for longer than it ought to be, and you know that it has been there longer than it ought to be because it starts to breed bacteria. And because something has stayed longer than it ought to, has stopped in one place longer than it ought to, it becomes this septic environment, a polluted environment. And so although it is true that there is this boundary around the self, I have this illustration that I've used before, that the self is surrounded by a wall. Again, this wall is the boundary and the identity that we can see and identify and perceive. Within this wall are numerous gates. There are times when we have to close the gates out of protection. But for the most parts, the gates must remain open because what comes in and what comes out is the very thing that keeps the self overturning, perhaps. It is like the vascular supply to various cells and organs. in which it takes or brings nutrients, and it takes away old devitalized tissue to be recycled and excreted. The self must have this relationship to the world, otherwise it cannot survive. And just like an organ has an identity of itself, we can identify the liver, the heart, the kidneys, the pancreas. They would not survive on their own without the outside influence. And we can keep on going layers of the outside. Again, we can imagine the vascular system as being the outside, the highway that brings nutrients to that organ. We can imagine outside of the body being the thing that contains the organs and all of this. And of course, there has to be material that comes from outside of the body, then into the bloodstream, then into the cells. There are these layers of interaction with the world. We ourselves are layers of interaction, it would seem. And it would seem that this would have to be the case if, through a man's desire, having separated himself, seeks and intermeddles with all wisdom. Or, from the translation of the New International Version, whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment. A fool has no delight in understanding, but that his heart may discover itself. So a verse that is not too dissimilar from verse 1, that warning. Except, in the first instance, we had somebody that was after wisdom, but after in such a way that he became self-centered and confused. But here we have somebody that doesn't really care all that much about wisdom or understanding. What he wants is the fulfillment of his desire. Now, the fulfillment of that desire is what makes it similar to that first verse. And it's interesting how two separate desires, perhaps I can't even say that, it is that desire seated within the self, within the isolated self. And how even if it is wanting of a particular path, if it is seated within the self, it leads to the same end. The fool has no delight in understanding, but that his heart may discover itself. Now what might that mean for his heart to discover itself? Well, I think this is the nature of selfishness. The heart, we have discussed many times, almost ad nauseum, about its nature. That it is the seat of our desires and our feelings, but it also has a degree of agency to it. It understands things that are a bit outside of the control of that self. The heart is also a directable agent. Like a child, it is easily convinced, easily seduced into believing whatever it is we want it to believe. And that heart, for all of its feeling, can be oriented and can filter reality in such a way that can prop up the self. That is, the only thing that excites is the thing that serves the end of the self. That is, of this selfishness, of this narcissism. Of course, one can imagine how this would be difficult in terms of relationship to another person. the person who is truly oriented inward towards the self, towards that narcissism, won't be able to truly understand and relate to another person, because all of their behaviors, their feelings are geared towards themselves and what benefits them. And so what exactly is this heart discovering? Because it must, we said it has an agency of itself. It has this movement, this sway. Of course, I'm speaking in symbolic language. Just as I talked about the different organs and how they have their own identities, I think there are layers of the mind that could be sort of interpreted similarly. The heart being one of these large layers, like the liver is this large organ. Now, when I say heart, of course, I don't mean the physical heart that is responsible for circulating our blood. I think we ought to explore the word discover. We spent a great deal in chapter 17 on verse 9. He that covers a transgression seeks love, but he that repeateth a matter separateth very friends. The word cover had shown up a few times, I think, in that chapter, and its meaning was quite significant. And now here again, we come across that word, cover. And just like the word transgression, we are concerned with the relationship between this covering and the self. And so let's break down the etymology of this word, to discover. Now, from my informal research here, the prefix of the word dis, the D-I-S, before cover, comes from Old French and Latin. It signifies negation or reversal. In the case of discover, it doesn't necessarily imply the absence of a covering, but a revealing or unveiling of something that is hidden. Now the word cover, Old English cavere, with its roots in Latin, which means to cover completely or to conceal. Now to discover, of course, is to remove that veil, and what is underneath has been revealed. It is the unveiling that which was previously concealed or hidden. And so, of the person, for a moment we can imagine that is not selfish. Can we say that the heart has not discovered the self? The verse says that his heart may discover itself, that the heart itself becomes self-aware. Now, we already understand that it has a certain degree of agency to it, but it is, as we have discussed, it is a adolescent agency. Often, children are not the most self-aware of individuals. Their self-awareness, their understanding about themselves increases over time as they reach maturity, as they reach adulthood. But I think there is something in the analogy to the innocence of childhood. and that of the discovering of the heart and its desires. And it's made a complicated matter because the fool is in the backdrop here. But surely a wise man would understand himself. Perhaps a wise man has led himself down paths that he ought not to have gone down, made mistakes, had played the part of the fool, and understands what it means. For as I say this, I feel as though I'm beginning to understand where some of my failure has come from. The heart discovering itself, being so concerned with looking in the mirror and so concerned about what it feels that it gets in the way of understanding. It gets in the way of life. It gets in the way of participating in society with other people. Now, I wouldn't want to over-exaggerate in terms of my own personal experience. I'm quite involved with, perhaps not necessarily the community, but with other people. In my work life, it is very people-oriented. I'm not a hermit. Perhaps even if I was a hermit, I would have to wonder about how one could make this work. Certainly I do have more of an introverted disposition. And I think that there is great danger to this introversion, the orientation inward. But I don't think it's damning in and of itself. So this marks a new day. This may be a rather abrupt change. And there is often cases that I do not articulate when a new day has occurred, but sometimes when there is a thought that I may have left incomplete, I think it's necessary to say that today is a new day. And perhaps what has been left must be left, so that we can continue something new, find something new. So we're going to move on to verse 3 here. When the wicked comes, then comes also contempt, and with ignominy, reproach. So I think it's necessary to start here with wicked. I've repeatedly define the wicked as the individual that is blind by the self. The Proverbs again are incessant, perhaps we can say, on the point of self-centeredness, the dangers of self-centeredness. And the wicked is this rather strange term, for they don't say evil, and yet the wicked and evil share common characteristics. The wicked are obsessed with themselves. They are concerned with only their selfish desire. This is in relation to the previous verse and the verse before that. That is this inward looking, and upon the inward looking, confusion that is unknown to the selfish, the absorbed person. The person who is delighted by their own feelings and about how they can increase their experience relative to themselves. Perhaps not relative to themselves, but for the sake of themselves. And I think that there is room for discernment here, and that is to say that not all feelings that involve the self are bad, We were talking about the excess, the complete, now when I say complete, I'm imagining terminal. I imagine not necessarily at the end of something that is the end of something so severe in intensity. Perhaps it may be that. But it is more the perpetual, the sustained longing for that home, for that surrender, for that place of peace within the confines and within the temple, upon the altar of one's own narrative and experience above all else. And in this way, the self is the complete. It is that divinity. It is that logos. It is that terminal. It is that end to which that individual is directed. By extension, we have those who are unable to appropriately or accurately determine. They're unable to accurately give an appropriate account to their judgments because they are blinded by the self. That is, they are willing to superficially rise above their own narcissism in order to see that which is beyond them, only so that they can bring it back into the self, only so that they can bring it back and sacrifice it on that interior altar. And it is because of this that they are unable to see and unable to be humble and learn from their mistakes in a true manner. Sacrifice appropriate sacrifices to something that is outside of themselves. For if something is truly valuable to a person, and I mean truly valuable, if there is something that doesn't ache the heart if it is to be given, then we have to wonder about its value. Now certainly there can be things that are truly valuable that don't burden the heart, but as a matter of man's experience, these type of sacrifices are very personal, because they must involve what is valuable to him, regardless of what is valuable in terms of a totalizing value, in terms of God's value set. And I think in order to learn, the part of man's judgment is to accept what ought to be valuable, is to accept what one ought to sacrifice, how one ought to be, how one ought to orient themselves to the world. The utmost discerning sacrifice perhaps rests within the amount of the self that can be lowered, that can be given up, that can be humbled, in order that one may see beyond those damp, dark, occlusive environment. When the wicked comes, when those who are blind to their own failures, when those who live within partiality, when the people of selfish orientation come, then comes also contempt. Now why? Why might this be? Well, surely contempt is disregard. Disregard of something that is or that ought to be taken into account. This feeling that something is beneath consideration, it is worthless, it is deserving of scorn. Now I'm rather surprised that scorn, it seemed to be in vogue in the earlier chapters of the Proverbs, but we don't see it much here in the middle chapters. But this word and the wicked seem to go well together. They are paralleled. And I think in their relation, within their union, I have come to understand what the Proverbs have suggested that the wicked are. Now with them, if they are to bring contempt, they are wed to this experience. And just as we have described, the selfish person is prone to that feeling that a person or a thing is beneath consideration, that they are, that there is this disdain on the part of the wicked. Now again, why is this? It is because they value themselves most highly. It's easy to find another person worthless when the only thing that one finds valuable is the self, is one's own experience. Again, the caveat is not that one's own experience is not valuable, but in the worship of that experience above all else is where the fall and that sin occurs. Chapter 16, verse 18, pride goes before destruction, and an haughty spirit before the fall. So we have seen the wicked come into our perceptual landscape, the landscape that we are trying to map out in order to understand how the wicked come to us, how they influence us as a society, as a collective. If we are to think and imagine ourselves for a moment, if it is not too hubristic, that we are this collective that lie within a city. We have the walls around our city, and the wicked have come to us like an invading army. Surely, this wickedness, if we are to be those that have given ourselves up to that divine source beyond ourselves, surely we are not free from temptation. We will always be influenced by this way of being. And it is not just within this illustrative landscape that we can find ourselves safe, for it is within every waking hour, within every moment that man has the ability to perceive his surroundings and is aware of himself. He is susceptible to this temptation. He is susceptible to this invasion by that of the wicked and the contempt that they bring, this destruction, this belief in worthlessness of anything other than the self. With it, the inability of the heart, the shrinking, the desiccation of the heart. Its experience and its vibrant character are all brought before danger. When the wicked come, then come also contempt, and with ignominy reproach. Now ignominy, this word means public shame or disgrace, humiliation, embarrassment, and mortification, disgrace, dishonor. In the same way that the wicked come with them, they bring with them their brides of contempt. With ignominy, we have in this illustration, it seems, less of a personification. Within the earlier part of this verse, it is easy to personify. When the wicked cometh, we can visualize a group of men, this invading army. But the second half, it says ignominy, ignominy, reproach. It almost has a spiritual dimension to it that is less personified, but no less impactful, perhaps even more so. And so just like an army may sweep into a city or besiege it at its walls, this public shame or disgrace falls upon every person within that city like a gust of wind. This sort of unavoidable spirit. Public shame or disgrace. Ignominy is such an interesting thing. Shame is an interesting thing. Shame, a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. I think of two situations here. The Proverbs have an interesting way of prompting the discerning mind, the principled approach to seeing. And of this ignominy, shame can be from a true dimension, perhaps we can say. That is, when one feels shame, they are feeling it for the right reasons, perhaps. That they are humiliated by something that is being exposed, something that is exposed of them that is amoral, that they should not be doing, that is absolutely something that they should not be doing, and not something they should not be doing relative to a free-floating, unattached cultural standard. When I say unattached cultural standard, that meaning that it has no place or no grounding, no anchoring to that path by which we ascend the mountain towards the peak, towards that divine logos. Or, if I could say so, even more, in a more obvious context, that which is imposed by somebody, the reproach that is imposed by somebody that is in a position of authority, but uses that ignominy and, by extension, the reproach that comes from that shame to fill their own glass, to meet their own ends. I think of communist China here in the mid-20th century, mid to early 20th century, with all of the denunciation trials, all of the shame and public guilt that was used to prop up the party and to propel the party politics. Of course, in no way was this sort of ignominy and the reproach therein any way of perfecting man. It was only to be used as a sacrifice at the altar of man's perceived own divinity. And I say sacrifice because those in the position of power recognize when a person may threaten to expose their own misdeeds, in which the society, the collective, the party would not be able to hold its parasitic grasp onto that multitude. And because of that, they used the very thing that would unravel that knot. They, the army of the wicked that brought with them contempt, used that ignominy and the reproach to keep people in line, so that they would not complain, so that they would, in fact, do the same to other people, all the way down that hierarchy, that chain, the worst kind of relativistic soup, in which there is not even a person who is concerned about the truth. Everybody is concerned about themselves. Everybody is concerned about their reputation, or what might happen to them because of something that they have said that would upset the selfish desires of another person. Ultimately, the person, the human divinity at the top, Mao Zedong. Of course, this is just one example of many. This is a pattern that occurs throughout history. It is not unique, I don't think, to the modern era. I was just reading in Herodotus about their difficulties with the tyrants and their proposition of Sparta to come and rescue them from their tyrants. The march of the wicked is long and persistent. The words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, and the wellspring of wisdom as a flowing brook. You know, I've had a thought just now, really not in relation to this verse. Perhaps it is, perhaps I can integrate it in some way. More so in the relation to the last verse. Ironically, I thought of myself. I thought of a conversation that I had, a rather intimate conversation with a friend. And it got to the point of trying to identify, or at least it sort of didn't explicitly get here, but it was in this realm of trying to identify that limiting factor that would otherwise, if it was not there, seemingly things would be much better from an experiential standpoint, from a life lived. And I think the word was, there was a word that was coming to mind in this conversation that was not on my mind. It was being manufactured in the mind of the person that I was talking to, but they couldn't quite get there, and I had interrupted before the manufacturing process was complete. And the word that I had used was nihilism. It was it was a bizarre response to interrupt and say nihilism. That's the thing that was limiting, perhaps we can say, for the sake of not recreating the entire discussion. And I offered nihilism, and then I quickly said, it's not nihilism. Perhaps at one point it was, but it is no longer nihilism. And to this there seemed to be an agreement, not necessarily an agreement, a pacification. But this pacification, I think, was to my detriment, because the honest response, I think I knew, was probably selfishness. The word that was being manufactured was probably selfish. Now, the thought that had occurred to me in relation to this selfishness was a reflection on my life. Of course, the irony is in full swing here of discussion about selfishness and the wanting to get away from selfishness, but then the inward reflection, and it's all so very difficult to be accurate, to be discerning enough to be on the path. But nonetheless, the period of nihilism is over. Perhaps the response was not invaluable after all. However, the thought was about the nature of the self, as broad as that sounds. What does that mean? The thought of the nature of the self, the thought of the nature of the self regarding my own experience, and how the self was formed, how it was shaped, what was necessary. And I think that there are certain events in life, certain events that can start at seemingly the separate places, and yet end up in quite similar locations. Now I promise I'll narrow this down and it'll become more concrete in a minute. But there's something to be said of traumatic experiences. There's something to be said about profound experiences, perhaps. There's something to be said in relation to the experience of the Chinese in the mid-20th century and of their run-in with that which tempted to destroy the self of every individual for the sake of another. In such cases, in such instances of profound danger to the self, to the very self we are trying to sacrifice, of course the very self that we are trying to sacrifice to an appropriate place, not to another man, but to something that is beyond man, to a God, to the top of that mountain, we choose to give it, so that we won't be limited by ourselves. And what of our journey? What if on the path we encountered this force that wishes to corral us such that our sacrifices are no longer to be made towards the top, and thereby our path is no longer to be the ascent, but the stagnant, or perhaps the descent, based on whatever the tyrant wishes. Would it not then be in our interest to preserve the self, to keep it safe, to lock it, to close it, to become, in a sense, selfish out of the wish for preservation, that we may, at some point, at some day, when it is safe, when the storm has passed, we can emerge from that cave, and we can continue our journey. And I think that this is the thought that I had that was about my own experience. And I won't go into it, but I think that for one reason or another, my selfishness, to the degree that it can be considered that, with the admission that not all of my selfish behavior is due to some noble preservation against a tyrant. There is a degree of that certainly is present, that I don't think can be denied in my own experience. That is, part of myself was hidden. There was that experience of introversion that is common among the wicked, common among the truly selfish, that was kept. It was kept the way that it was, out of fear for its dissolution, for its destruction, by something that was from without. But it was not God, It was a tyrant that I was afraid of. And in my very fright, I found myself in the deepest and darkest of caves that one can imagine. Unsure of how to get out, unsure of how to see the sun again. And that had stayed with me. Surely it still stays with me. Perhaps I could just see where I'm going. I know how to find myself out of this cave now, but for a long time, the preservation and even as time takes a toll, that preservation turned into perhaps comfort, perhaps genuine selfishness, perhaps. Perhaps the greeting ground for nihilism to take hold, for this giving up of not being able to get out, of wallowing and wandering in the darkness for too long. Again, the interesting thing is it takes the individual to see within the darkness, and to make that decision to get out of it. They don't know, they feel like there's no way out, they don't have the map to get out. They don't need a map to get out. They need to give it up. Once they give it up, the light will come down to them. The way will be shown to them. The words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, and the wellspring of wisdom as a flowing brook. Now I think the experience, that self-reflective bit that had just occurred, I think is integrated quite well with this verse. That is, within that self-reflection, within the wanting of something a little bit more, something more than that of the loneliness of the self, a man can find himself in deep waters. Deep waters in the sense that it's confusing, it can be scary, it can be emotional, but it can be healing, it can be illuminating, it could be meaningful. And at the end, regardless of the words of this podcast have made the connection that I've made in my mind, the understanding that the words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, and the wellspring of wisdom as a flowing brook, seem to make sense. And I should pause and say that as I associate my own self-reflection to that of deep waters, words that are of deep waters, again I recognize the risk of self-praise, of pride. But I can imagine that this situation is as easily observed within the self as it is within another man. Perhaps it's easier from without to hear the words of another, or perhaps it's not. It's hard to hear the deep words of the inner self as it is hard to hear the deep words of another man. And that is because the deep words within the self do not rest on the superficial narcissistic desire. They rest within the unnodding, the dissolution and the surrender. just as they do if one is to accept what somebody else is to say, if they are saying words of any depth at all. They must be humble when they approach such people and their dialogue. It is not good to accept the person of the wicked, to overthrow the righteous in judgment. Now, how to even start with a verse like this? Because we have a strong declarative. Usually, perhaps it's difficult to say. Just before I pressed record, as I thought about the verse for a second, I was thinking about my illustration that I have been using often, this super relativism that can be deceiving to some. That is, it may tempt people into thinking that everything is relative, that there is no truth, that there is no purpose for anything, that everything, and by extension, people can veer off into all sorts of strange philosophies and things. And then there's the view that, no, there is something that unites everything, and that the soup that we find ourselves in, our own failures, ought not to distract us from putting the pieces together. And then another thought occurred to me at the same time, this sort of unfortunate reality of the mind that's afflicted with a bit of an attention deficit is, I was thinking about just the nature of where we're at now in our society, and how difficult it seems to grasp the true nature of large wavering, I wanted to say failing, but I'll say wavering for now, wavering institutions. That is the shakiness of one's foundations, perhaps the insecurity. In my mind, it flashed a memory of when I was in college and having to give a presentation. Definitely that anxiety can shake the foundations of what you think you understand, and it can affect the way you deliver that information. And the same, I think, is with institutions. But also, there are fundamental qualities to institutions, or people that are within the institutions that may truly be antagonistic to the institution's function. And that over time, the spirit that the institution produces, inhabits, whatever, becomes something that many don't want to believe. Many people continue believing that an institution and the effectiveness therein of how it once was in the prime of their day continues to this day, and that leads to them continuing their support for said institution, or there's a failure of understanding of how it changes over time. Whatever the case, these things came to mind when I read, "It is not good to accept the person of the wicked, to overthrow the righteous in judgment." Now, the first thing there, of course, is it is not good. So the question is, well, what is good? And that's a massive question. There are a lot of things that could be said about what the good is. Now, the word good can be traced back to Old English, from Old English to a Proto-Germanic language, to a broader Indo-European language. And this broader Indo-European language, or language family perhaps, the word good is from Gedeh, or Ghedh, which is associated with the concept of fitting or suitable. And so if we imagine good in this manner of fittedness and suitability, obviously it doesn't quite encapsulate all of what we consider the good to be, but it's an interesting place to start, I think. That if something fits, what can we say of it? There's plenty of different analogies that we can use. That of a key that fits into a keyhole that serves the purpose of unlocking so that we may open, so that we may pass a threshold and enter. Fitting implies something is able to go in a particular space, that in relation to the other objects around it, it is not obscured when it is put in place. It is not prevented from being put in place. If something is suitable, it belongs where it is. If a person is suitable for a job, they possess the necessary characteristics and qualities to perform that job. They are proficient in what is required of them. We could think of fittedness in a scientific context in terms of the evolutionary context, that survival of the fittest, that is, the organism that is most fit or suitable to the environment, that like a puzzle piece fits that picture, they are likely to survive because they possess the necessary characteristics to navigate that landscape. That's not necessarily the organisms that can outcompete another. It involves a broader illustration and landscape of the fittedness of the organism. It is the relationship not only to other organisms, but also to the earth. Again, that landscape, the ecosystem. And so I think what I'm trying to get at here is that the nature of the good, of course I'm not going to develop a definition to encapsulate this term. It's an ongoing term. It's a term that certainly does have a definition, but it's something that can be played with. It's something that, much like the pursuit of a man's life, that ascending this mountain towards the peak, towards greater and greater understanding as the mountain narrows towards its peak. The concept of the good, I think, is very similar. It is similar. I think it's equivalent. That journey towards the peak is the journey towards the good. And so what emerges here is an illustration of fittedness, of suitability, of, again, I've talked a lot about levels of transcendence, talked about identity and identification. For man, the good extends even further beyond the objective view of the levels of the identification, because it involves our experience, it involves the emotions of the heart. It penetrates every aspect of us. And the fittedness, of course, of our emotions, our desires to a particular context, is certainly something that we can consider. That's certainly something that we can modify. It's certainly something that, given certain situations, there are emotions that are more appropriate than others. This, in turn, lies nested within cultural expectations and historical development. Again, it is a piece. I've talked a lot in the Psalms about the Russian doll phenomena. There is an image on one of the episodes of the Psalms that has a Russian doll. It's sort of an abstract representation of a Russian doll, but it is nonetheless a Russian doll. That is this doll. On the outside, it has its expression. You take apart the doll on the inside is another doll, same expression, and you keep going all the way down into a very small doll that is of a similar look and build to that of the first one, except it's just different. There's a difference in scale. And I think in this way, each one of these dolls, each one of these levels represents that nested nature. And I think the fittedness in this context is the similarity of Russian dolls. That although every level might be different in some way, the level that is inferior or within it, depending on how we want to look at it, fits. It is recognizable. It is something that we would say, okay, yeah, that should be there. That makes sense. That is reasonable. A lot of these things are difficult to pinpoint. A lot of the words that we use. And of course, we can make this more of a trusted experience by proceduralizing in it, or I should say proceduralizing it, in the sense that we can be methodical about the way that we come to understand things. We can observe, we can make hypotheses, we can test them, we can come to some conclusion about the patterns that are represented in the what is observed or within the data. So in this way, let's say it is not something that is suitable, something that is not fitted. We could think of an ethical context. We can think any number of contexts. It is not suitable to accept the person of the wicked. Now that language there I find interesting. The person of the wicked, like it's a person is a piece of some broader whole that we say that this is the wicked. It's a platonic form that is the wicked, and it just like we cut a piece of cake off of it, becomes a person, or rather infects a person. So it is not good to accept. Now when I say accept, I think to trust, to perhaps believe, to recognize, to receive. And I think this acceptance has to do with the community accepting the individual that comes in. Perhaps a stranger from a strange land comes to a new city. Now there's great danger with accepting the stranger because we don't really understand what they're bringing with them. And perhaps it's not easy at the outset to see the wickedness of a person until they have been sufficiently embedded within our lives, and then we begin to notice it over time because they are not fit. It is that fittedness, that integration, that seamless integration with the rest. Now, of course, that's a stretch to say seamless integration because, of course, a man's relationship to one another is fraught with difficulties, no doubt. But wickedness, I think, is of a different sort. It is not just reconciling differences. Wickedness is an attempt to exclude the possibility for reconciliation, I think, because on behalf of the wicked, on the part of the wicked person, or we could just say on the part of this whole, the form of the wicked, it is not concerned with reconciliation. It is concerned with its own existence, its own being. It is not concerned about the fittedness of itself within something else. It is the Russian doll, the rebellious Russian doll, as if we took apart half of the Russian dolls and then we all of a sudden we found an army figure on the inside. It doesn't match in character, it doesn't match in shape or form or expression. It is out of place. And so if we were going to if we were to use a rather crude analogy, I think of one of those puzzles with those pre-cut pieces that at the end there is an image that will be produced by the integration of all of those different pieces together, their relationships to one another. To accept a piece that has a writing or an image, part of an image on it that has nothing to do with the image that is being built or being produced, then of course we don't want to include that piece. It's not going to match up with anything. It's irrelevant, and it should be kept separate. It is not good to accept the person of the wicked, to overthrow the righteous in judgment. Now this can mean a few different things. To overthrow the righteous in judgment could mean to make a false judgment about somebody that perhaps committed or is perceived to have committed some wrong, but it is not their behavior that is wrong. It is the perception of the behavior that's wrong, that led to the judgment. And so, much like fittedness, much like man's interaction with other men, that relational aspect, there has to be that discerning element. There has to be an openness to understand the other side, that they can be potentially wrong. And just like in the Proverbs, that there is this continual prompting, there's many repeat verses, there's many repeat themes. The continual prompting and slow integration of different verses, different ideas, opens us up to the experience of examining both sides. Now, I've said often about the ascent to the good through this, upon this ladder. Every step or every rung is illustrative of some transcendent experience. Transcendence would imply a new way of thinking, a new way of being, a greater degree of understanding, and an illumination of mind that connects more things together. So a person is capable of taking on more responsibility, of developing stronger and firmer relationships, of making wiser and more effective decisions. All of this, I think, is wound up in that imagery of transcendence. And certainly we have all experienced transcendence from maturing from a child to an adult. But along with this process of ascending the staircase, there is the Proverbs prompts us to consider what it takes to move up and to ascend. It is not as easy as it might seem. The staircase is presented before us. It's simple enough. All we have to do is walk up it. But each rung presents, despite our illumination, transcendence from the previous rung, we are faced with new challenges, new problems to overcome, new dilemmas, whether they be ethical or otherwise. We are confronted by these things, and these problems keep us humble. If, I should say, we listen to them. And now, when I see to overthrow the righteous in judgment, it is not good to do so. I see the experience of man's transcendence in this way, that at the points of transcendence, the point of profound change, transformation, when we make the decision to ascend, we are also making a sacrifice. If we make a false judgment and we make a false sacrifice, we will not be able to ascend that rung to the next one. And now, if we put this verse together in relationship to the acceptance that it is not good to accept the person of the wicked, I think it complicates this matter. For if we are to bring in the wicked, we are bringing in this pollution in our experience of transcendence, of moving up the levels. It makes us harder to see and make effective decisions. It makes us harder to understand what sacrifices actually need to be made. And it may pull us down on that ladder. A fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calls for strokes. So a fairly straightforward pattern here. And I was doing a little bit of daydreaming when I read through this verse. And I think that there is an illustration present in one of my recent experiences, a recent exchange with a friend of mine. We were talking about the nature of insurance, and he made a good point, and I believe that I made a good point, and I think that they were both true, but they, again, in terms of fittedness, depending on where we placed it, if we brought up a certain example, then perhaps our statements wouldn't necessarily hold up. There would have to be modification. And I think it was my failure that I approached it in a contentious manner, more of a debating manner, but not a debate in terms of a way in which we can both be elevated, but rather I wanted myself to be elevated and that he should follow my lead. And I think that this was a sin, and I should not have done that. It was foolish, just in the way that this verse says, a fool's lips enter into contention and his mouth calls for strokes. Now perhaps I didn't necessarily call for strokes, but in a way, if strokes can be imagined in the perceptual sphere and the conscious sphere, certainly there was the desire of the heart pointing in that the desire for the blows of the of debate, of defeating the enemy of the opponent. But again, this is somebody that I love, and I ought not to do that. It ought to be perhaps a question, a prompting, just like the Proverbs do for me, to say, okay, let's zoom out a little bit, and let's think about how we can integrate our ideas together, because I think that there are truths to both of these, but we have to be able to find a truth that we can find an agreement together on. So in that way we find our fittedness together. And although we may not solve the world's problems as regarding the nature of insurance and the institution that is insurance, we can at least be united, and we can at least perhaps illuminate some of the landscape that surrounds us, perhaps that we didn't think about before. And if both of our points are to be true, it is within the uniting of these things that again may produce more of a radiance. A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. So another verse to the fool, and yet we have entered, I think, a layer down into the individual. Before we were thinking of the individual and his relationship to others. Now we are thinking about the fool himself. We're thinking about the damnation of the fool. So we, just as we did in the previous verse, I failed to go into any sort of detail about the symbols. Symbols are sort of, I do this all the time. I say they're self-explanatory, but then once they are focused on, once they're illuminated, it tends to offer a lot of interesting insight. Sometimes it's a dead end, but that's more so, I think, due to a lack of creativity and foresight rather than the nature of the symbol. But nonetheless, a fool's mouth is his destruction. Let's begin with that. And I want to begin with the symbol of the mouth. And what can that mean? Of course, in our minds, we can represent this symbol. We could think of it in our mind's eye as somebody's mouth. We could think of a physical representation. But of course, that in and of itself is not enough to satisfy the meaning that is trying to be conveyed here. For if that's all we thought of, the fool's mouth would be probably some cancerous lesion that would lead to his destruction, that would spread to the rest of the body, that would lead to his death. But of course, that's a superficial way of seeing it. There are ways of understanding that is beneficial to seeing and to recognize disease of the physical body, but we're talking beyond this. We're talking about man's nature. So a fool's mouth. We are thinking about the organ of expression. We are thinking a degree of perception here. We are thinking of the mind and its capability. We are thinking about the outputs of the mind. We're thinking of the way a particular type of person has formed ideas in their mind and has put forth something. And what is this something? Well, it is something that is meaning. It is this packaged thing. We are bringing things together to a point. And this point is being, again, expressed. It is through the mouth. And in this way, when we think of meaningful speech, when we think of our thoughts, when we think of our ideas, in this sphere, the way in which these are integrated, the way that this experience is related to the world, and how the world, how all of this stuff moves out into the world and our relationships with other people and comes back to us. This experience, we have to imagine, in the case of this verse, that on the receiving end of the fool is destruction. That is, when he has sent out his meaningful speech into the world, it has found itself inside of a cavity, we can say. Within this cavity, it has been modified by the external environment, and it has been processed by other people. It has been integrated, it has been chewed on, it has been digested, and it has been returned to us in a new way, in a new manner. Or I should say, returned to the fool in a new manner. Hopefully that we are not all fools. And the manner in which it returns is like a dagger to the heart. It has a dangerous velocity to it. And so, okay, we have this poetic understanding, however superficial it might be at this point. The interesting thing is that this is not the first time that we've seen it, but mouth and lips are used separately here. And we have to imagine, well, why are they used separately? Why not just use mouth twice? So we have mouth compared to his destruction, and then we have lips are the snare of his soul. Now, when I think of the lips, I think of something, this isn't quite true, but of course the lips are part of the mouth, so there's a bit of some difficulty here, but the mouth, in terms of the cavernous space within, I think of something that is more broad, perhaps. And in terms of speech, it can be our rough understanding, a rough idea, but it's more than that. It is our true intention, perhaps we can say, of the mouth. And of the lips, we have the fine-tuning element. And in the context here, we're talking about the fool's mouth, not necessarily the wicked, but I think even within the foolish nature, we can think of a manipulation that the lips can provide through their fine-tuning nature, that within the fool's mouth, the lips are a sort of deceiving element, a deceiving organ. In verse 6, when we were talking about the fool's lips enter into contention and his mouth calls for strokes, here again we see that pattern. A fool's lips, this contention, it seems like it's verbal, there's a degree of sophistication and manipulation. And then the second half we go into, and his mouth calls for strokes. It's broader. It is moving towards that behavioral element. The strokes, I think of fighting, I think of violence to a degree, I think of blows. Verse 7, a fool's mouth is his destruction. Again, it's this broad, expansive event, perhaps behavior we can think of destruction. And his lips are the snare of his soul. Again, it seems more precise. It is a sophisticated sort of thing. The snare of his soul. The soul is quite deep embedded within the identity of man. And a snare is something that catches. It is something that keeps. It holds. It doesn't hold so pleasurably. It holds so in such a way that it is a type of holding in wait for judgment, and wait for death, and wait for destruction. And so for this to happen, to capture one's being, one's soul in the snare, and for this to come from himself, it is the auto-snare, from his own lips. Certainly this is the full expanse that is the fool. The fool is a person that is so silly, so stupid, that they don't recognize that the very thing that they're putting out there, sort of unlike the wicked, or so self-absorbed, who may not even recognize what they do, but they do so willfully. The foolish, it's a step below not even recognizing. It is the belief in something and not even having the foresight to put two and two together, to understand how this can lead to the snare of the soul. It is not because of, I suppose it can be, but it is possible that it's not due to excessive selfishness. It could be just inattentiveness. Now the evil is in the extreme. It is the 100% understanding willfulness. Again, it includes that wickedness, probably a degree of the foolishness. But in any case, the downfall by one's own deceptive nature is what we are dealing with here. A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. And I have to imagine that when something gets caught in a snare, it is, obviously it's unable to escape. It is there for whatever had laid the trap comes to prey upon it, or it is subject to something else that did not lay the trap, but still would prey on it. It provides, or is, a vulnerable position for the fool to be in. And for the soul to be exposed, this is the roughest of nerve endings to be exposed. This can change a person entirely. They can be manipulated to such a degree that they don't even have, they fall into a degree of servitude, perhaps. We could talk about destruction of the physical self. There is this fundamental loss of connectedness if their soul is to be preyed upon. Their meaning in life is disrupted. And such a terrible thing it would be to find oneself in such a position. The words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. So I think there are a few ways that we can view this talebearer. In the first instance, I think we can think of the talebearer as somebody that comes to somebody else or a group of people and tells a lie or an untruth. And I think that this is sort of our secondary meaning. This is our fallback meaning. I think what is primary of the talebearer is one that tells a narrative, a story, spreads gossip about another person, a group of people. They spread secrets about the wrongdoings of another or the faults of another. They are, in this way, the judge, though this judge is a person that spreads their judgment behind the person, behind the awareness of the person of concern. So we have in our mind this type of person. Now these people, as the verse describes, are as wounds. Now wounds are a break in the skin. It's a break in continuity. It's a break of a barrier. Not just a break of a barrier, but it is an injurious break. It is an insult. Now, in another way to illustrate this, I think we can imagine a fertile landscape that is the conscious perceptual landscape. And within this soil is spread about the seeds of rumor. And within these seeds then sprout perhaps the seed itself is something that was true about a particular person. But as we all know, as rumors spread, just like that elementary school game telephone, where one person may start with an expression, they pass that expression on to the next person behind them, and so forth and so on, until the last person, by the time that expression reaches the last person, it has no resemblance to the initial expression or meaning therein. And considering this quality, but not limiting to this quality, we can just as easily content ourselves, I think, with conversing about the potential harms that can come from spreading information behind or beneath somebody's awareness. And there are certain types of information that when spread beneath somebody's awareness can have, just as this verse says, an injurious impact. But again, to return to our conscious landscape and the seeds of rumor that are spread, what we may find around us are the blossoming of lies or untruthfulness, of falsehood. And this falsehood becomes this thorny growth upon an otherwise fertile substrate. And so what does it mean for these injurious words to descend all the way into the belly? And not just the belly, but the innermost parts of the belly. The belly is a symbol of importance, no doubt, in this verse. But what can be said of it? What can we, by our own experience, understand of this belly? We think of the stomach. We think of location in our physical body, on our physical body. The belly has a way of communicating with us. We understand when we are hungry. We can feel, perhaps, in the depths of that belly, emotion. It can cause us distress at times. It is a good indicator of if something that has been consumed is something that can be tolerated by the body. That if it is something that is intolerable or potentially injurious, it can make us sick, It could be poisonous. It can cause severe systemic damage. It is a place where we understand that digestion takes place. It is a place of breakdown. It is a place not only of breakdown, but also of discernment, because the reason that things are broken down is to take what is essential from them. Now, if we are to equate this food with potentially gossip or scandal or rumor, and just as food, it descends down into our belly. What would we do with that nutrition, or lack thereof? What do we think the response of the belly would be when it encounters such a thing? Well, if we are to say that the words of a talebearer are as wounds, we understand that this is not a positive thing. This is not a nutrient. This is not something that is sustaining. It is quite the opposite. It is the thing that breaks barriers. It is the thing that disrupts. And so if something is going to go down to the innermost part of the belly and disrupt it, it has the potential for causing systemic impairment. Again, injury and insult. And as we expand this analogy, or we zoom out, and we say, okay, we understand how this applies to the body. But just as it may apply to the body, I think it can apply to interpersonal relationships. That is, the digestion of this information, whether it be by the person that has been exposed or undermined by the talebearer, or whether it is the people that receive the information from the talebearer. They are receiving information or nutrition that is not adequate to sustain the truth. The truth, in this sense, is the body. The belly is the apparatus by which we come to understand that truth. Furthermore, if they, that is, the injurious words, the penetrating words, go down into that belly, they are interrupting the mechanism by which we understand something to be true. He also, that is slothful in his work, is brother to him that is a great waster. I think this is a verse that's powerful. I think it's useful for every person, especially when we go through these periods of, I want to say insecurity, but it's more than just insecurity. It's doubt. I guess doubt would be a form of insecurity. But again, more than just doubt and insecurity. It's fatigue and exhaustion, the want of relief. And just like many things, just like trying to identify something, that identification of just fatigue that would then warrant some sort of relief or break or rest, I think is very difficult. Moreover, from that, I think it's even more difficult to determine exactly what a person ought to spend their days doing. What faithful work actually looks like. What good work actually looks like. And there are certainly many principles that we can come up with. But given the discerning nature, we have to imagine, given the context that it finds itself in, does it make that work actually as good as we think it does? Because we can apply certain characteristics, certain principles like discipline, attentiveness, perseverance, courageousness, leadership, all of this sort of stuff, but we can use those things in a context that brings about something that is actually morally corrupt. And I think this is what makes it difficult, because certainly those things are valuable, but they are value, I don't want to say relative, but they are value in relationship to a superordinating principle, something that unites all of the various inferior, we can call virtues perhaps, the virtues that are corruptible, the virtues that can be used for evil purposes. And perhaps the answer that might set us on the right path, at least the answer to this dilemma of, well, what exactly makes a man slothful or makes him a great waster. Now, of course, we can identify very easy situations, very easy cases, perhaps. A case in which a person spends their days watching Netflix after they have gotten home from work, when they could be spending that time to other purposes, purposes that would benefit them, perhaps increase their effectiveness at work. But then again, what if what they do at work is not serving God? Is it the case then that just like Netflix, what they do at work is just as slothful, is just as wasteful? Although, the difference between the two, there is some productive force that's being generated, and it is contributing to the community in some way. But it's very hard to see, given the multiple nodes of this very intricate market economy, how exactly our efforts play into the whole thing, especially if we're part of a corporate institution. That aside, let's run through a couple thought experiments about the nature of the slothful and that of the waster, as we have an equivalency here. The sloth is a slow animal. Okay, so that there is some indication of the negativity associated with slowness, which we could probably expand to laziness, which is I think can amount to inattentiveness, inattentiveness combined with selfish desire. Those two lead, I think, to the pursuit of base pleasures, pleasures that will not benefit the self. They will not benefit in the long run. They will not benefit the community, the society. They will not enhance the individual's experience of life, nor be able to participate in the communal experience that can come from strong family bonds or strong community bonds. Now his brother, we could say, I said there's an equivalent, but a brother necessarily is not the same. They're same in terms of same family, but that which is slothful and that which is wasteful, I think, differ to a degree. And I think I have conflated the two to a degree. Now, a characteristic that I'd like to add to the slothfulness, so we have this laziness, the inattentiveness, we can say avoidance of work, perhaps, but also idleness. Now, most people, to a reasonable extent, are forced into a state of activity to provide for themselves. Now, there are many situations in which people can abuse life situations that they find themselves in, abuse the charity of their parents, abuse the charity of the community, of the government. I think that this abuse typically comes from the sloth, but it also can come from the waster. Now, when I mentioned the confusion or the misintegration or the misidentification of the slothful. I think I put some qualities of the waster in with the slothful. Now, the slothful may be after base desires, but I think that the excess that comes from the satisfaction of base desires perhaps doesn't necessarily rest within the slothful. I think it rests more firmly within the wasteful. That is, the excesses, the over-the-top, are from those who they have this drive, but the drive is nowhere good. It's not looking up. It is not towards transformation. It's not towards ascent. It is, again, inwardly directed. There's a negative pressure from within the self that tempts to make any decisions in life such that it can satisfy the inner desires. And in this situation and in these people, I think what we see is often an idolization of money, of material goods, wastefulness of resources, perhaps wasting food. We have this strange culture on the internet, on YouTube, in which people become quite popular by destroying things, and it gets a lot of views, and they make a lot of money out of doing it, and it really doesn't make any sense. And it's not until after they have made an unfathomable amount of money, then perhaps we might start to see charitable behavior by these people. But it is quite a strange thing to observe culturally. I think the mind is attracted, it's tempted by this wastefulness, by the wasteful lifestyle. It is a disregard for conservation and frugality. And of course, as with everything, we can extend the slothful qualities and the wasteful qualities beyond just the singular, beyond just one man. We can extend it to the community, to an institution, a corporate body, a university perhaps, a government institution, a courtroom, a nation, a state, a family unit. Anything that has the possibility of becoming an identity is, I think, susceptible to this sort of thing. And I should give the caveat here. The identity is, of course, of the conscious sort, because otherwise, obviously, if it's inanimate, it won't be able to enact behavior. So the human being is the catalyst. It is the fertile substrate by which these temptations and these barren, I want to say barren trees, but crops that don't produce grain, we could say, something that is that grows within the landscape that is utterly unconsumable, and it is a pollution on the landscape. It is perhaps a sin that man is unable to produce for himself something that can sustain him, and it is the condition, the slothfulness and the wastefulness under which man cannot form effective institutions, effectively love another person, effectively reason, effectively find something that is true, to come to some sort of agreement, to identify that unifying principle in the various aspects of life. There is wide-reaching consequences. For he also that is slothful in his work is brother to him that is a great waster. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous runneth into it, and is safe. Now, this might seem strange, but now when I read the word Lord, I felt this peace come over me. And I felt the peace because finally, after going through plenty of verses, not that it has been so long ago that we've seen the word Lord, we saw it in chapter 17, verse 15. In chapter 17 there are 28 verses, but by virtue of the way that we are running through the Proverbs here, we're taking quite a methodical approach. Each verse sometimes can last up to 30 minutes for interpretation, or an hour or more. And in that time we are coalescing, we are concentrating our ideas, solidifying understanding, and often conceptualizing the landscape, conceptualizing the path, how it looks for a man to walk the righteous path. But we don't often find, I should say perhaps that my primary illustration has been the mountain for the past, I think, couple chapters. That is, at the top of this mountain, at the peak, we have that divine logos, the thing that we ought to be all marching towards. And when I say that we ought to be marching towards it, because every man that does walk towards it benefits, because he transcends those levels of understanding, of awareness, of feeling, of, I should say, appropriate feeling, properly weighted feeling, interconnectedness with the world around him, the people around him, the confidence of self, the understanding of principles, the security in the face of chaos and disharmony, disunion, the understanding of how to actually to take desperation and fill it with love, and much like a bacteria that is penetrated by an immune cell and the thing just sort of bursts, that desperation likewise is burst when that love and that truthfulness illuminates it and dissolves it. It resolves that sense of hopelessness. It allows us to understand the traversability of that which otherwise seemed and felt to be impossible to cross or to transverse. And so we call this unifier God, we say Lord, we have this word that if it doesn't mean anything, we ought to be marching in a different direction. Because we ought to have this word. It is a beautiful word to us. And for us not to fill it with meaning is to our detriment. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The first part of this verse is saying exactly what we've been talking about. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. Again, it is up to us to accept the path, accept the responsibility necessary to fill that word with enough meaning for it to be that strong tower. It's not enough to say strong tower. We can imagine a gigantic stone building that is very tough, that would prevent a lot of things from getting at whatever resides inside. But it's purely a physical analogy. The Lord is something that is very expansive. It is the top of that mountain, underneath which all of intelligible reality spreads farther and farther apart, as a mountain does as it reaches its base. And so we have this beautiful cast, an array of images, of colors, of different beings, of life, of the perceptibility of all of that, the confusion, the wonder, the chaos, the love, all of it birthed from that central point, from that word that we call Lord, that we call God. The righteous runneth into it, and it is safe. Of course, within our perceptual landscape, now everything, even our confusion, our own projections, let's say, since we are in the image of God, we have this capacity to do this thing, this very unique thing, this projection. Perhaps at times more sophisticated than others, no doubt, but regardless of the level of sophistication, it can cause the deepest insecurities. And within these deepest insecurities, we find ourselves in, again, that relativistic soup in which things appear to individuals as completely relative, that what is true to that person. They create truth with their mind. That truth is relative. That something is in relation or in proportion to something else without there being that divine unifying principle, without there being this fractal structure all the way to the top. That is, certainly the word relative makes sense. It is not something just because that the relativistic soup and the belief in pure relativism, I believe, is wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that just because I believe that is wrong, doesn't mean that the word relative isn't appropriate in certain situations. When I say fractal, I mean to imply that within the relationships, they all are ordered and connected above in such a way that these ordered nodes and connectedness all scale up towards that divine unifying point, and they all exist within that intelligible sphere. Now, man cannot perceive, cannot make the entirety of the material world intelligible to him. He only has a select window to do so, and he can expand it by understanding the laws of nature, understanding all that there is for the perceptual sphere to see and to experience, even though it might be beyond our ability, but much improved and augmented through the use of tools. The name of the Lord is a strong tower, and the righteous runneth into it, and it is safe. Now, I'm not sure what more I could say at this point. I think I've reached the end of my creative capacity, which perhaps isn't all that much. But I think I will continue with the next verse 12 of chapter 18 of the Proverbs. Verse 11 next time.